Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. President Trump has staked a lot of his economic and his foreign policy agendas on his expansive use of tariffs. He's imposed tariffs on nearly all goods imported into the United States, according to the latest figures that I saw, bringing in more than $30 billion a month. They have sparked US trading partners to engage in frantic negotiations, some of which have resulted in big trade announcements. But the details of some of these negotiations have not yet been fully hammered out, and so some of them are still frameworks. And now there are fresh questions about the constitutionality of them. When they came before the Supreme Court, we heard skepticism from a majority of the justices. So there are big questions going forward about whether the Trump administration will be able to maintain these tariffs or not. And on State of Play, we've talked quite a lot about tariffs, or at least they've come up in a lot of our discussions, but we've never focused specifically on them. So what have US tariffs actually achieved? What are the geoeconomic and geopolitical shifts that they've caused? And we are joined today by CSIS's two leading experts on this to guide us through these questions. Navin Girishankar is president of the Economic Security and Technology Department, also the host of a podcast that you should all listen to, Betting on America. Navin, welcome to State of Play.
Thank you, and thanks for the plug.
Yeah, of course, of course. And you told me that you have something to share.
Oh yeah, when the tariff war gets hot, I always listen to reggae. I'm a big reggae fan, so you wanted me to share something that people wouldn't know about me.
Yes,
that's a big one right there.
And I actually know something else about you and reggae.
What's that?
Bob Marley. Rita
Marley.
Rita Marley.
When I lived in Ethiopia many years ago, the Marley family had come over for the 60th birthday of Bob Marley, and I had a chance to meet her, and she came over to my house, was even thinking of taking it over because I was moving.
Yeah.
And we had a great conversation, and she had released her book, No Woman, No Cry. It was really a memorable moment for me, given that I'm such a big reggae fan, and I really love them. So
amazing. Not on your bio, but important. And Phil Luck, thanks so much for joining us as well. Phil is the director of the economics program and also the Scholl Chair in International Business. You most recently served in the Biden-Harris administration as deputy chief economist at the Department of State. But I just learned something about you that I certainly did not know, which is you're also an Iron Man.
Yeah, isn't that annoying? Yeah, very long time ago, before this job, yes. Okay. Back in grad school when you have much more time to train,
We have multifaceted experts at CSIS. Thank you so much. But let's dive into it. And in order for us to really understand if tariffs are working, if they're achieving what they were meant to achieve, I think we have to talk about that first. So can you take us back and say, what are the stated goals of the Trump administration as they relate to tariffs? What were these really meant to achieve?
I'll get started, but Phil and I talk about this all the time, and so I'll get started and then hand over to him. When you take the stated policy and what the goals were, there were multiple goals when they launched this. One is in the reindustrialization of the United States. The second is a number of national security goals. In fact, the coupling of the tariff agenda with these national security goals, for example, fentanyl interdiction with the IEEPA tariffs is one of them. And the third one, which people often forget, is they started out the administration laying out a bunch of revenue goals with tariffs. And so these three, I think you hear at various stages of the the last 6 to 10 months of the 6 to 8 months of the Trump administration.
Yeah, completely agree. I think from the very beginning, it was about reindustrialization, bringing jobs back, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. the fentanyl issue, which Navin raised, I think, to me, the broader way to think about that, which is exactly right, is it was about leverage. They wanted to use this as a tool to make other people do things that they didn't necessarily want to do. And the last, of course, is revenue. I think, we've talked a lot about the fact that like those goals are kind of hard to, or almost impossible to achieve in unison. If you want a tariff for leverage, you need to be able to put it on and take it off and be dexterous. That's pretty bad for an investment climate to reindustrialize. So those two things are really hard in conflict. On the revenue point, that's the thing they really have done, right? To your point about, 30 billion a month.
Was that right? Is that how much it is?
I've heard numbers close to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So another number is, there's about 90 billion on the line right now. If the Supreme Court decides against the administration, there's $90 billion they're going to have to find a way to reimburse back to businesses.
To give back?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I hadn't realized that was
okay. Another layer of implementation challenge that,
yeah.
Phil is absolutely right. I'm really glad Phil raised the leverage point, because it's not only important to understand what they were trying to do or what they are trying to do, but how they've gone about this. And I think most observers, from global investors to think tankers to everybody else, will underscore the highly volatile and uncertain and erratic way in which this has been implemented. So like even independent from, assessing the effectiveness of the policy itself, it's the orchestration of the policy which has an independent and sort of accumulative compounding effect on the investment climate and broadly what people would describe as American exceptionalism.
And I'm remembering there was a lot of talk about these penguins on an island that were subject to tariffs. Is that kind of what you mean when you're talking about the haphazard way in which they were? I mean, presumably it goes much beyond the penguins.
Yeah, that's like that's like a design issue, because they like which countries, and there's that with the Liberation Day tariffs, which was earlier in the spring. But I also mean that like literally week to week, there's a different set of decisions.
Right.
So sometimes moving this direction, and then with the very same country moving in another direction, and so that kind of volatility. I mean, I remember early on, Phil and I were talking about this. I had seen a chart which was an intraday tariff rate. Can you imagine? And so like that's what I mean by unpredictability. Like imagine what that means for businesses. But Phil might have some insights on this one.
No, to your point about the penguins, this was a uninhabited island that like got on the tariff chart somehow with a remarkably high tariff, and so that created a lot of jokes among economists about what those penguins had done to us. But no, so to Navin's point, it's not only about like the levels, which were really high and seemingly put together in a haphazard way, but it's also just the uncertainty created by the complete variability over time, right? They're one thing one day, then there's another thing, and then there's a truth social post that says it's something else. So that level of uncertainty just makes it really hard to do business.
Yeah.
Now, I want to do one thing, if I may. Like, let's just take the Steelman version of this, because I just want to be. It's really important to be fair to what they were trying to do. There are two things, and I actually welcome Phil's thoughts on this. One is that trade imbalances have been an issue for a long time, like going back to the 80s, right? Going back to the Plaza Accords, and then coming out of the GFC. These issues have been at play, like what's these structural imbalances in the trading system. So I wouldn't say that it's not an issue. It's an issue. It's a question of how do you address it, right? Number one. And number two, I think if you look at the full gamut of the Trump administration's policies and locate tariffs within that, they at various times have said, well, our game plan is tariffs for the reasons we mentioned, tax cuts, and deregulation. And I've heard various commentaries from people who are in the administration or aligned with the administration who've said they've variously described this as nationalist libertarianism. Someone like Vivek Ramaswamy will say that. And what they're trying to achieve is a nationalist economic policy, but the benefits of American dynamism and market dynamism internally. Like there is a vigorous debate to be had about whether you could do that. And so I don't know, Phil, if you had a thought on that.
No, I think that's a good way to describe it. I think that's, you're going to put pretty big walls up around the United States, but then try to, get rid of red tape within the United States. I think the real challenge there is just how global supply chains are and just how global U.S. business is and just how reliant on U.S. inputs from around the world and revenue from around the world our exceptional businesses are.
So let's talk then about what they have actually achieved in terms of the economic impact. We've already started talking about the revenue piece, but can you dive a bit deeper into that? How successful have tariffs been in terms of bringing in revenues?
That is the thing they've been the most effective at. I mean, in some sense, that shouldn't be super surprising. It's a tax. Taxes create revenue.
But don't they say it's not a tax?
Well, that's we can get when we go to the Supreme Court, we should definitely go to that because they're arguing it's a regulation because regulations allowed under IEEPA, taxes are not explicitly noted. So that's what they're trying to do there. But no, it's a tax. So, they collect revenue. From whom is a great question. Is it the foreign seller or the domestic buyer? It's always usually shared, economists think. But they've definitely raised revenue. Again, so it's been, I think the estimates are if these stay on for a year, it's going to be in the range of $200 to $300 billion a year. It roughly balances out the tax cuts that are the one big beautiful bill, right? So we actually haven't seen a really big negative effect on the deficit from that bill because of the tariff revenue. And so this is something they've been very effective at. To me, that's as a trade economist who is not entirely aligned with the tariff policy, that's a concern to me, though, because then that means that whomever wants to change this policy is going to have to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars or say, what are you going to cut in terms of expenditures that counts for hundreds of billions of dollars?
Yep.
At this point, we can't write it off. It is a genuine source of government revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are great points from Phil. And I would add, here's a question, which is, you're trading off different sources of revenue here. And it's worth asking the question about what are the productivity impacts or the competitiveness impacts of these different fiscal or tax policy regimes. And I don't know if Phil has any thoughts on that, but to me, that would be the question given the global nature of supply chains and particularly technology supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, economists don't love tariffs because they're a distortive tax, right? Basically, they're what you would love to have is a world where you can raise revenue while distorting the incentives of business as little as possible. And unless you have those special cases where you do want to change their behavior, where it's emission taxes or things like that. But generally speaking, if it's a tax for revenue, you want to not distort behavior. You would like your firms to be able to source the best stuff from the best cost suppliers. And things like this, they distort behavior. And we're seeing that in the data. I mean, manufacturing productivity in the United States hasn't gone up for about 15 years. We've been kind of flatlined for 15 years. It's starting to go down, right? Productivity in manufacturing. Employment in manufacturing is going down. Output is flat, if not going down, right? So if the goal is reindustrialization, and potentially you do need some form of tax and subsidies for that, you'd like those to be as supportive of the goals and domestic goals and the industrial goals while being the least distortive. And tariffs tend to not be a great tool for that.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I just, there's something I wrote about a few months ago, and Phil just reminded me of it. I argued you can't, this was probably somewhat inflammatory, but I said you can't fight a tech war if you're fighting a trade war. And what I meant by that is that, as Phil said, a lot of these technology value chains, particularly for advanced or acceleration technologies that are going to drive competitiveness, chips, life sciences, quantum going forward, elements of the AI stack, these are inherently global supply chains. And so when you're putting taxes, particularly on long-established trading partners, it flows through to those technology value chains and your ability to be competitive there. And I think that, he's underscored this point, and I just put my version of my framing of it. I think there's a contradiction in the administration's approach here, both on tariffs, but also, I would say, an accelerationist approach to technology. We know their AI action plan, which is really quite a strong document and game plan, has this inherent contradiction within it, and it's worth noting that. So
you talked about competition and the tech wars, so maybe we can talk a bit about China now. What has been the really high-level impact of tariffs on China? broad question.
Yeah, I mean, so it's been fascinating. I mean, the U.S. and China have gone through several phases of this sort of second, Trump 2.0 trade war, which in a lot of ways replicated the 2018 trade wars. I think that the interesting thing to me, to change the question slightly, is the lack of impact or the preparedness of China for this. In some ways you can think about, they had 4 years between the first Trump administration and the second one to get ready. And they seemingly did, right? They did that by, doubling, or they doubled down on some of the old tricks that worked pretty well. They cut off their demand for U.S. agriculture, soybeans, sorghum, corn, other things. That had a big impact. They retaliated with their own tariffs. They put tariffs up, pretty much mirrored us, not quite as high, but substantial. And they sort of, flexed new muscles with their restricting of rare earth minerals, right? And this wasn't just new muscles; it's new authorities to, if that's the right word to use for that system. They built out extraterritorial export control regimes. They didn't have the first time around. They couldn't have as effectively done first time around. And because they've been, in some sense, I think they were more ready for this. They've got pretty different results, right? I mean, I think the Xi-Trump meeting that we just had, we both kind of walked back from the brink. We sort of de-escalated, but in that de-escalation, the U.S. lowered its tariffs without having a similar immediate reaction from the PRC. And it rolled back national security export controls, the U.S. did, which is really the first time they've done that in this sort of in a trade war like this. So in some sense, the U.S. has blinked a few times recently. And I think that's because of the way that China has responded to the administration's raising of tariffs.
This is such a great point that Phil raises, because what this implies is something that was relatively sacrosanct, say something like export controls. This is based on a hard-nosed assessment of what the national security risks are, say for dual-use technologies, given civil-military fusion on the PRC side. Now this is a subject of negotiations. This is now variable. It's not sacrosanct.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And I think that I think it's something we should really linger on for a second when you think about what that means for our long-term ability to use economic tools to further our national security goals, or to defend, I should say, against national security risks that play out in markets. So anyway, I just want to reinforce what Phil has said there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in terms of how then other US partners have responded to this, how would you characterize that? It seems like a lot of them have capitulated in a way, sort of bent the knee, agreed to these huge investment deals. Is it fair to say that's because of the tariffs? Does that mean we should treat this as a success in a way?
Yeah, so couple of things. One is, if you let's talk about specific partners, Japan, Korea, the EU, UK. I think in many of the cases, what they've done is they have played well. They have responded by agreeing to a number of provisions in these these new style trade agreements that the Trump administration's announced, that includes purchase agreements, investment agreements, some technology components, and in some cases, some national security components. And so they've sent all the right signals that they want to work with the Trump administration. But I think what it underscores is that the defense umbrella, which many of them enjoy, has been a driver of this. Phil, you've talked about this in the past. But that's point in time. So if you play this forward, I have a thought here, which is many of them are beginning to hedge the China and U.S. risk. And in this case, hedge U.S. economic coercion as a potential reality because they've just experienced that. And so that's really something we should be watching for in the months and
how should we watch for that? What would the first signs of hedging look like?
I look at it in 3 or 4 ways. Number one, what are the public statements by the heads of state? They've obviously been very, very careful right now, and I would expect them to continue to be careful. Mm-hmm. 2 is what's happening at the subnational level. Think about the following, like cities and states in a country like Korea, and what movements are they making with similar partners, say in the PRC, right?
Oh.
3rd is I would look for deal and the deal flow, both between, say, PRC and the country involved, and third countries.
Yep.
And so just look at the deal flow and what happens over time. It's too early for the trade data to reflect this, but we should be looking for evidence of hedging. And I don't think we should take false comfort in like photo ops and things that have happened short term, because imagine if you were in their position, would you, not think about hedging given the being at the receiving end of basically American leverage, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. And I think this is going to be tough for folks in our position and others who are trying to think about this and look around the corner. To Navin's point, the hard economic data is going to be a lagging indicator of these decisions, right? The trade data is going to lag a lot. Investment data might be a little faster, but those are, by the time we see stuff there, we're deep in the problem, right? So I would say we need to start thinking about how we can think about this more carefully. And again, it's going to be diffuse, right? So I mean, the EU is considering joining TPP. They're doing negotiations with India, right? The world is going to go on without us. And to Navin's point about the defense umbrella, look, I mean, it seems pretty clear that Europe was willing to accept certain things that maybe wouldn't have otherwise, because it had genuine concern about this administration's willingness to conflate security with economics, right? Mm-hmm. I don't imagine they want to be back there again in the future, right? And so that's going to make them make decisions about the European defense industrial base, European digital sovereignty, all these things that, again, no one wants to, to the degree to which we have understood or we've discovered that we have a lot of short-term leverage, I think people are going to want to try to ameliorate that leverage going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Phil makes a good point. Look at the FTAs that countries are signing with third countries, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to find a market as big as the US other than China, but they may be doing that with a number of other countries. I heard that when I was in Europe. Phil and I were in Europe together. We heard that as well. So that's one indicator. The other thing to watch out for is, there's been a fairly open reevaluation of industrial policy over the past decade, and many countries have been pursuing that, obviously US as well. But look for an acceleration of industrial policy efforts by countries in response to this. And I think ultimately that's not great for global for global productivity. It's not good for it, but that's what's beginning to happen. So, I don't know if Phil, if you agree with that piece, but.
No, I agree. I mean, in the same way that like trade is good because it allows us to access bigger markets and benefit from, one fixed cost can serve a whole area. If you then decide that due to geostrategic reasons, you have to duplicate these tech stacks or duplicate these huge investments across a bunch of different blocks, it just raises costs for everybody and lowers, global productivity. So not ideal in the long run.
Yeah.
I wanted to just step back for a second because I know we've talked about this, and I just want to throw this out there. When the administration started, there were different versions of their geoeconomic strategy that you could hear in the public domain. When they got on in front of the camera, I talked about it. So President Trump had talked at various points about, let's call it a deal of all deals with China. He would strike a deal with Xi, and then he would use that as leverage with allies and partners who he felt had taken advantage of us, okay? You had Secretary Bessent at various times talk about an encirclement strategy. And he's even recently talked about this. Let's get together with the allies, cut a deal on trade, cut a deal on many other aspects of investment, technology, and then we would strike a hard bargain with the Chinese on things that were on the table with them. Well, the reality is the scattershot approach, like take Liberation Day, the scattershot approach with allies and with the Chinese have left us in a position where we have had neither, right? I don't think that the recent announcement with the Chinese reflects kind of a great deal with them, right? And so are we now just more isolated? Is that where we are? I think so. But I think that's worrisome.
And I did say at the start that all of this might kind of come tumbling down if the Supreme Court rules that the president doesn't have the authority to impose tariffs like this. What would be the effects? Would that undo these effects, like the negative things that you've been talking about in terms of allies and partners hedging, the loss of leverage as it relates to national security, or at least the beginning to negotiate over these national security things. The idea that the US is more isolated. Could we just reverse that?
So I don't think so. There's a few reasons why I don't think so. One is I think we've shown the willingness to do this, and Congress has shown the lack of willingness to step up. So like that, we've just lost like trust there, which I think is a big piece of this. The other thing I think is important to note is not all these tariffs would come down. Right. So basically, IEEPA, which is an emergency authority that, is the basis of a lot of our sanctions regimes around the world, is what the president's using for this. Notably, the statute does not actually include the words tariffs or taxes, which is why they're arguing they're a regulation right now, anyways, in the Supreme Court on Wednesday. But those tariffs are the Liberation Day tariffs, that's IEEPA. The fentanyl tariffs on Canada and Mexico, that's IEEPA. The tariffs on India for buying Russian oil, that's IEEPA. The tariffs on Brazil for legal cases is IEEPA. What's not IEEPA is a lot of the tariffs on China, which predate, those are what's called 301, so basically a competition issue around them stealing IP. Those were put in place in the first Trump administration. They have wide latitude to put any tariffs they really want on China. So that's not really going to be affected by this. The other tariffs that are not IEEPA are all the industry-specific tariffs that are under national security justifications. So that's steel and aluminum, all the derivative products, which is hundreds of products, autos, wood, lumber, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. So those will all stick around. Interestingly, a lot of our sort of negotiations with our close partners, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the real sticking point has been things like auto tariffs. Right? They want those down. So even beyond the fact that the tariffs will still be in place, the key sticking point tariffs are still sort of have the ability to stay in place. And this administration has known since they put these IEEPA tariffs on that they might lose them, right? This was, at best they thought maybe 50-50, right? So it's not like they've just been standing pat. They have plans to put additional tariffs on. So short run, they will have the problem, as we talked about. They'll have to figure out how to give back $90 billion. But in the longer term, I don't see this changing either the strategy of the administration or, hugely tariff levels on most of our major trading partners.
Yeah, that's an excellent rundown by Phil. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as I think we tend to draw these conversations to a close with three rapid round
Before
questions.
You do that, may I ask one? Can I just make sure
Please.
We hit one more thing? Because I think it's really important and people are watching for it, which is the domestic impact on inflation.
Oh, yes. We didn't talk about inflation.
So I don't know, Phil, if you want to hit this, but I just think that it's starting to flow through. There's already sort of services inflation that was already upticking. It was an uptick in that really post-pandemic. And then on top of that, you're beginning to see goods inflation. And I think you can't delink that from the tariff agenda. But Phil has a closer view on that.
Yeah, no, I've been watching closely, and we've been doing some work on this as well that hopefully will be published in a few weeks to months. But no, there's been a lot of good evidence. I mean, prices are going up. I mean, there's been really good work out of Harvard and Penn recently using basically, consumer prices. So basically scraping an enormous amount of consumer data. At this point, prices, the pass-through rate, or basically the percentage of the tariff that's being paid by the U.S. consumer, it's about 20%. So that's low by sort of historical standards of tariffs. But again, that's just what's being absorbed by the end consumer. We don't see what's being absorbed by the firm in the middle, what's coming out of profits and revenues, things like that. But also notably, that's increasing over time. It's pretty clear that early on, firms were trying to, eat the tariff, protect market share, hope some of this went away. And the more that doesn't happen, the more they're passing on to consumers. And more interestingly, too, this data is really fascinating, the micro data. The increase in tariffs, or the pass-through rate, so the percent of the tariff that consumers are paying, is about twice as high for low price versions of goods. So what that basically means, it makes some sense in the sense that there's lower markups for those goods often, so they have to pass on more of the cost. But what that means practically is American consumers who are buying lower price alternatives are seeing about a twice as big increase in their prices as their consumers who are having higher priced goods, right? So if we're talking about affordability and Americans being unhappy with sort of the state of the economy, this is going to start biting more and more.
So a really important research question to look into is the distributional impact, meaning how regressive is this? when you look at the tariffs relative to the tax cuts.
Yep.
So like you could look at the aggregate numbers on fiscal, but then if you look at the distributional impact, that's a real question. And I think Phil has put his finger on that. And then the one last thing I want to add, which is on my list, is the impact on the dollar.
Oh.
And so, here's the thing. There was a point in time swing during Liberation Day with equities drawing down, yields rising, the dollar depreciating. So that's capital flight, signal capital flight, gold appreciating. And then it corrected. And the question, though, is like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to the dollar reserve currency? And I think that, Phil is well placed to describe, like, what do you think happens when you put tariffs in place for the dollar short term?
Yep.
Some people say it would appreciate, obviously, because the impact on the demand for, foreign goods. But through time, the uncertainty that the tariff agenda, that's characterized the tariff agenda, can have an impact on the safe haven quality of assets, of the US dollar, I should say. So I don't know, Phil, if you would agree with that, but that's something that I've been paying attention to.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that. I think just to add one tiny thing at the end there, I think this also, I'm fascinated to see how the bond market responds to the IEPA decision for this reason, right? Because there's a lot of things going on there. There's, other branches of government sort of stepping up and maybe constraining the executive, but also, again, where's that revenue coming from, right? So there's all sorts of interesting things going on there, and I really have no idea what's going to happen, but I'll be curious to see.
Yeah. Okay.
We didn't even let you finish.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No,
that's
you
the
are.
Risk of having us
exactly.
on.
Yeah,
exactly.
no, you're not the first ones. I've had some rowdy guests that want to. Yeah. Anyway, some rowdy guests. So my final questions then. So can you sum up tariff strategy in one word?
I'll give you 3.
Okay.
Checkers, not chess.
Okay.
So mine is one word from this week. It's regulation, which again that's the word that the administration is trying to bank on to make these fit with IEPA. IEPA allows the president to regulate, investigate, direct, compel, nullify, void, prevent, prohibit. It does not explicitly say it can tariff or tax. So that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to say it's regulation.
All right. We'll watch out for that. Okay. Of the US, China, and Russia, who is up and who is down the most?
Well, a point in time, I would say, given what we said about loss of leverage, I think China's got the upper hand.
Yeah.
U.S. down. I think Russia's not part of this equation, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, economically, obviously, Russia is very isolated. In some sense, they're in a good position to weather a tariff fight with the United States because we don't really trade with them. I think that, it's China right now, just because I think they've shown that they potentially have escalation dominance over the United States with this rare earths card, and that's important.
So G2, you're focusing on China and the US. Okay, so now the kind of more fun one. Is there a word or phrase that you wish you could ban pundits from saying when they talk about tariffs in think tank world more broadly? Phil?
So it's going to be a kettle calling the pot black or whatever, because I use this word several times today, but leverage. I wish we could stop using leverage for tariffs, only for tariffs, because I think this is my problem here is trade negotiators think about this as tariffs as leverage. It's true in the short run, but it's just not true in the long run. And I think that's a poor framing for an economic policy tool.
Okay.
Actually, I'm gonna promise not to use that. At least, at least for the rest of the day.
I'll be watching.
You know what my word is or phrase? Inflection point.
Oh.
My goodness, please.
We use
let's
it all
stop
the time,
using
don't
it.
we? Yeah. Okay, so to recap then, so to start off, you talked about the original goals of the Trump administration, talking about trying to boost industrialization and bring back manufacturing to the US. You've talked about it as leverage, even though you've now said I'm not allowed to use that word, but you did talk about it as a tool of leverage, trade rebalancing, addressing some of these deficits. And then you've also talked about it, of course, in terms of revenue and generating revenue. And when I listened to you talking about the impact, I was hearing a real difference between the short term and the longer term. So I think in the shorter term, you're saying it has brought in a lot of money, a lot of revenue, but there are actual real problems with that in the longer term because it's going to be really hard for future administrations or even this administration to find other ways of raising that revenue when it was coupled with the big tax cuts at the same time. And then you've also said that the administration may be forced to give back or find $90 billion if this is struck down. And then as it relates to inflation, I think you've said actually so far the amount that customers have paid is not so much, although it's skewed towards those buying poorer quality goods, but that's likely to go up going forward. And then when we're talking about the geoeconomic impact, yes, some of the key US partners have forged deals with the US in the shorter term, but we're beginning to look out now for signs of hedging. And signs that actually the US is losing some of its leverage in the longer term, negotiating over things that used to be sacrosanct. I think, Navin, you said that in terms of national security. And you've said that could happen at multiple levels, this hedging. We should look for free trade agreements being signed with third countries. We should look for what's going on at the subnational level as well. And so overall, I don't get the sense from you that you think that tariffs are really working, or at least they're bringing in a lot of money now, but some of the longer term costs are going to be real for the role that the US plays in the world. I hope I did justice to trying to summarize what some
I feel like you should just put that at the front of the podcast, and people don't have to listen to the rest of it.
Well, Phil and Navin, it has been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. I have learned a huge amount. I really knew very little about this. So thank you.
Likewise. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. I hope you'll come
just
back.
a plug. Phil's got a lot of stuff coming out in the next few weeks and months on this topic. So
wonderful. And we will
Yeah.
we will link to your work in the show notes as well.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.